Good morning, everybody. We're
Hello.
here to welcome Richard Tanter, who's going to talk to us about the issues we've been thinking about here in Western Australia about Kojarina, Stirling, and Harold Holt. Before we do anything, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Indigenous land, pay our respects to its elders. Here we're on Whadjuk Noongar. Everybody's coming from all over the place. Let's also remind ourselves that sovereignty was never ceded. A formal introduction to Richard. Richard is well known to all of us, I think. He's an analyst, he's an activist, and he's an advocate for peace. He was formerly president of ICANN and formerly director of the Nautilus Institute, which I've just been informed has had its money taken away from them by the bad people. We have an agenda. We'll try and stick to it as tightly as we can. Please be patient as we work our way through it. Firstly, we're going to have a conversation with Richard about HMAS Stirling, and that's going to be led by Leonie Lundy and Chris Johansson, who will need no introduction to local participants. And then after that, Elizabeth and I will talk to him about Harold Holt and Kojarina. So from this point on, for the next short wee while, Leonie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Kaya, everybody, and thank you, Richard. I'm just going to give a quick 1 minute update because we do have a few folk that are not in our group as to the impact of AUKUS specifically on HMAS Stirling, which is on Garden Island and Cockburn Sound, 20 kilometres as the crow flies from Fremantle. This is Australia's largest naval base. It is the home port of the Collins-class submarines and of the frigate fleet, as well as other Australian naval assets. Under the AUKUS Optimal Pathway announced in March 2023, Stirling is receiving increased visits from UK and US nuclear-powered submarines, although to date it's just 2 instead of 1 per year. Then, as of 2027, up to 4 US Virginia-class and a UK Astute SSN, ship submersible nuclear, will be on rotation there under the program Submarine Rotational Force West, providing also for training of Australian crew and support personnel. The US rotations also come under the Force Posture Agreement. More on this later. As a stopgap in the 2030s, pending availability and the US President of the Day tick-off, maybe 3, maybe 5, Virginia-class SSNs will be procured from the US, while Australia's own SSN AUKUS fleet of 5 to 8 supposedly will be built at the new Osborne shipyard in South Australia, based on the UK BAE Systems design. We in Stop AUKUS WA are sceptical of the Virginias and even the SSN AUKUS ever eventuating, but are increasingly alarmed by the obvious intent for the US to use Stirling as its Indian Ocean base point, expecting Australia to participate in its drive for dominance in the Indo-Pacific, often termed its war on China. One aspect that continually haunts our campaign is the possibility at which point the US nuclear-powered submarines could be nuclear weapons capable or nuclear armed. So, Richard, we're very keen, please, to hear your perspective on this. Over to you.
Leonie, thanks very much. You've said almost everything that I think is important to say. So I may just jump about. Let me go to sharing and yeah, here I go. And it's the PowerPoint. Just a minute. Sorry. Okay, am I sharing the right thing? Is this up there? And I thought I had this organized.
Richard, we can see your slide. Yes.
Yep, there it goes. Okay. Okay, I'm going to, I'll leave you to sort out time because just tell me to stop when I know. As Christopher said, it's a twofold quick presentation. But firstly, the argument I want to make is that setting AUKUS, dealing with AUKUS is really very important, and you are in the front line of AUKUS Pillar 1. But it really can't be separated. And I guess Leonie's hinted at this in terms of the connection with wider patterns of Australian militarisation. And one of the things I find talking to people, even in peace groups, is the idea that Australia is, in any sense, militarised doesn't jibe. It's almost as if it's culturally invisible. One thing, talking from NAM in Melbourne, is it's clear that the impact of militarisation is in the north and west. And for the highly populated southeast, it's not invisible, but it's hard to see. The second is it's a very particular kind of militarisation. It's not goose-stepping, it's not generals ranting, it's alliance-dependent high technology. And what's interesting is if you remove the alliance part of that, the high technology disappears very, very quickly. The third characteristic, which is really important, and I'm sure you're very, very aware of this part, is there are very severe limits on defence decision-making today, resulting from US, or what would be called in the case of China, foreign penetration, US political, economic and cultural penetration. The result of that, and AUKUS is the prime example, this is leading to a kind of learned incapacity in our key decision-making institutions to distinguish between American and Australian national interests. There may be times when we want to say they align, but there are certainly going to be many times when they do not. And this is a point that both former Prime Minister Keating and former Prime Minister Turnbull made very clear, as did Malcolm Fraser in an earlier stage. Now, there are two key dimensions for what the Americans are trying to do in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but more broadly, actually, for refurbished alliance system. And certainly they worked extremely hard to change well-established patterns. For Australia, this means the hosting and enabling of American weapons platforms. B-52s at Tyndall you know about, and you know even more about what's happening at Stirling. So the platforms. And the second, which is rather older, is but an expansion of hosting, or what's now called much more partnering of the enablers of American warfighting: command, control, communications, intelligence, surveillance. And Western Australia, of course, has got the lot. I think, Leonie, you've circulated some of this material, so I'll just say something quick. I'll move on to the next slide. I think I don't know as much about what's happening at Stirling as you do. At least, certainly, I hope that you know a lot more than me, and you can talk about it. There's a small web page up, just working out on a couple of issues, and I'll just note the contents there. You can have a look yourself later on. Looking at the Defence Department's version of the program, then the American version of it, courtesy of Congress: base planning, nuclear radiation, waste hazards, corporate involvement, and then American planning for the expansion of the Virginia-class submarines, the so-called Australian Virginia-class submarines, and then the question that Leonie raised of nuclear armament. So I'll only touch on a couple of those very quickly now. That image is the one you've seen and probably laughed at for a long time. It's still, the Australian propaganda is really remarkably thin about it. Leonie's comment, I think, is very, very important. The Collins class, well, they will continue in some form, perhaps extended still further, we don't know. The major part of it, in terms of money, is the construction of the SSN AUKUS class by the British and possibly with some Australian shipyard involvement. That's where the money is really going to disappear down the tube completely. But the important thing is, firstly, the second line on increasing port visits. And then, in particular, the so-called, and then the submarine rotational force west, probably starting in 2027. Let me say something about that in a moment. I would urge you to look at the American congressional documents, and I've listed one here. I don't know whether you know Congressional Research Service is what the Australian Parliamentary Research Service would like to be if it was ever allowed off its leash. And this is a very, very detailed account of the issues that Congress is facing about the provision of Virginia-class submarines to Australia in one way or another. So they're
Excuse me, Richard.
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Just in the interest of time, rest assured we are really, really well aware of the Congressional Research Service's
all right.
documentation. We've been using it for over 18 months in our campaign, and it is one of the reasons that we've become really skeptical, as I mentioned, about all of this. I think it's really great that we've got the full PowerPoint for reference, but I'm just really concerned that we're not going to get through everything today. Would you please mind focusing in on the issue, which is a major concern for us to do with the nuclear weapons capability?
Okay. Yep, go. Okay,
Thanks.
going on to this, going one back. Okay. The Virginia class comes in a number of different versions, which are simply evolution or developments. What are called Block 5s are going to be about 10,000 tons. That's a very big submarine. They're going to be about 25 meters longer than the existing ones. And this is in particular to accommodate what's called a Virginia payload module. And this, contrary to what they have in the existing Virginias, will be vertical launch tubes for Tomahawks, perhaps, but in much larger diameter launch tubes, which could take either 4 Tomahawks or a number of new submarine launch missiles. In particular, what's really important is the possibility, and it's not only a possibility at the moment, that a new submarine launched cruise missile bracket nuclear will be able to be installed in those payload tubes, that payload module. That submarine, the new cruise missile, is still subject to vigorous debate between the old Biden administration people and Trump and inside the Navy. The question is, there has not been a submarine-launched missile on American submarines since 1992, when Bush the Elder issued a directive to take them off at the end of the Cold War. The arguments in favour of, from an American point of view, of a submarine-launched cruise missile essentially come down to the question that faces all American nuclear decisions: how can we make nuclear warfighting survivable? Survivable in the sense that we will not provoke all-out nuclear war. In other words, you could send a signal, particularly a signal shot. And Virginia-class submarines would be one way in which that could be done. The point is, we're still a long way from seeing Block 5s launched. We're a very long way, at least 8 to 10 years, to a submarine-launched cruise missile bracket nuclear, this new type. It's not designed. It's certainly only barely been authorised. So we're a long way from that. And of course, that presidential directive from President Bush could be reversed at any time. It's not a legal binding matter, but they do have to make a major decision about it. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Okay, what about, sorry, I'm moving in here very quickly, Chris. What about the potential for visits from the SSBNs as opposed to the SSNs?
Yeah. Okay, the submarine launch, the SSBN ballistic missile submarines are really a very different animal. They're much bigger, but they basically very rarely come to ports other than their home port. There was one recently in Busan in South Korea, which sparked a lot of question marks about why it had been done. The question may have been that it was signalling to North Koreans to behave, that kind of argument. There may also have been some maintenance issue that was not publicised. But basically, the idea of the SSBNs is they set out from home port, lose whatever trailing surveillance they may have, and then they spend their time in the deeps of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean and they're very, very hard to find. And they are only useful to the Americans as their primary nuclear warfighting capacity if they cannot be found. So they don't want to come to port and then risk being trailed from there. So we may see them, but I'm not aware of a SSBN coming to Australia. Are you, Leonie?
No, not specifically. There was a bit of information that came out from the US that hinted at it, and hence we are obviously concerned and wanting to sort of get as much information as possible. So what you've said is really reassuring, and we thank you for it.
I'll just quickly just say, look, this is the data going back to the 70s and early 80s. And then there were, in the early 80s, 10 or 11 submarines coming a year. And this is so far, we have no more than 2 a year. So that's an interesting thing. And the question I would ask you is anyone, has anyone spent time working on the patrol patterns of these submarines that actually are coming?
Okay, two things there. Number one, trying to get hold of information ahead of time. Yes, we have a record, obviously, and this is a very succinct overview of it on your slide there, which is great. Thank you. But in terms of getting advanced information, it's pretty blooming difficult, as you can well imagine. The place that usually advertises or sort of promotes the idea first of a submarine just having arrived is the US consul site or Facebook page, believe it or not. And then, of course, the media pick up on it at the same time.
Yeah.
But yeah, we are aware that it is at the most 2 a year, and the next one is expected in November, which will coincide with the standing up of the Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Regulator.
I think I'll expect another one this year. The question is, you're quite right. It's very unlikely you'll get advance information about that, and that doesn't matter. I'm more interested in the question, I think, of what do they do after they leave your port and where have they come from? So, for example, the submarine tender, which accompanies roughly once a year in the pattern we've seen there, which is really important for them when they come in for 3 weeks, went off to Darwin otherwise. Now, where did the submarines also go? Did they go anywhere else? And particularly, this is for peace movement purposes, making a connection with peace movements in their home ports, and in particular, Guam. I mean, the Guam people has a very strong peace movement there, and I'd urge your group, if possible, to make some connection with them.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you. I know that IPAN folk, or some of the folk from IPAN, are in close contact with them through the Pacific Peace Network as well. So that's good. Richard, we've only just got a few more minutes, I would say 3 minutes before we really need to move on to the next section. Really keen to know, please, if you have any comment on the impact of the US SRF West rotations occurring under the Force Posture Agreement. Of major concern to us is that, as per Article 5.5 of that agreement, the US has a very concerning say in the emergency and safety measures and any public announcement of those. I don't know if it's sort of in your remit or time and energy availability, if you've even been able to look into this, but yes, just interested to know if you've got a comment there, please.
Well, only that the FPA is wholly non-transparent, and I noticed the other day that somebody said the Defence Department had nominated several bases as being covered by the FPA, but I don't recall them saying Stirling. I have no doubt that it is, and I've written on that issue about the transparency there. I think the people who are watching radiation issues will be the people to talk to about that.
Yeah, Richard,
I'll just finish with one thing. There's one of the propaganda pieces that's been coming out here and in sort of academic research circles is, of course, the fact that the reactors will be on and reactor waste repositories for the present time will be on defence land, as if that's some kind of protection. It's utter nonsense, and particularly the idea of a social license somehow being granted. And so that's a campaign line of effort, as the military call it.
Yeah, that is one of our major campaigns at the moment. Richard, just a quick reminder, I did send you a copy of that, what came out of Senate estimates listing the facilities, and HMAS Stirling is definitely
As
one
on.
of
Okay.
their
Thank you very
three
much.
special facilities. So
Thank you. I missed it.
hence us knowing that it now falls under the FPA.
Yep.
Chris, did you want to just make a very quick comment on Henderson? And then I think we really need to hand back to Christopher and Elizabeth and Richard to look at the other aspects.
Yes, just very quickly, Henderson is on the mainland, about 10, 15 kilometres from HMAS Stirling, and currently it is a marine centre, for commercial, and the intention is to, it's been claimed, to build dry docks at Henderson, which is very concerning, because to what extent, I mean, if it's a dry dock, what are they going to do with the waste? They're going to make another controlled industrial facility on the mainland? Are they going to put it in a nuclear powered canoe and send it to HMAS Stirling? And also, to what extent will the force posture agreement come on to this mainland quite near where I live? So this is one concern that we just have great difficulty finding out what's going on. It's just reports here, rumours there, so on. So if you know anything more about this, please let us know.
No, I don't, but I'll pass on what I have. And I think your question is very sensible. And I would actually say it would be really important to talk to people who know something about submarine building. The point is, of course, that all the people who did know about submarine building were working on the French issue and then were blindsided by the secret development of the AUKUS submarines. But people like Peter Briggs or Alan Beam, who is not a builder, but who was involved in that. But Peter Briggs is a very sensible naval person. And it doesn't hurt to ask those people.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Okay.
They're really angry, I promise.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Richard. I think we should hand back over to Christopher and Elizabeth, and rest assured, in terms of this aspect of HMAS Stirling and the rotations, etc., we'll keep you informed further to our public meetings when we can grill some of the ASA folk, hopefully in a couple of weeks. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Leonie. Richard, on to the next couple of issues. Now we'd like to briefly talk about HMAS Harold Holt in its kind of central role in communications, talk a bit about the development of its increasing importance as a space surveillance center, and then go on to Kojarina. So the first question that I've got for you, we've been investigating quite closely what's happening at Harold Holt. We know that there are tens of billions of dollars being spent in developing the facilities there. We know its key importance strategically in, I think it's one of 3 or 4 key US naval centers that manage its global reach. I think what is interesting in putting the facts together to make a narrative is how closely is the Australian military and the Australian government involved in decision making about what goes on at Holt? Is it like Pine Gap? Is there this fantasy that there's full knowledge and concurrence with what's going on, or is it more murky?
Well, certainly the Defence Department would say full knowledge and concurrence definitely applies to Harold Holt. Actually, I'll be more careful. To the communications facility, and in particular, since the mid-90s or so, it's actually been run by the Australian Navy. And there is, however, very considerable murkiness about what communications the US Navy is now using it for since they moved back a decade or so ago. They don't control it. It's controlled by the Australian Navy On the other hand, it's a communications facility. So if you've got to plug into it, if you can plug into it, you can say things. And we know very well that by definition, there is no way that any Australian government can have a say over military communications out of it. So it's labelled full knowledge and concurrence, and it's another example of how hollow that label is. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but if you know more, I'd be interested to know. But we know perfectly well that in the past, Australian governments have been ignored. The doctrine of full knowledge and concurrence was developed for Harold Holt, but that's nothing. In fact, I would say over Pine Gap, we have more knowledge of what can happen.
Gosh, that's a terrifying thought. Okay, on to the next part of the question about Holt, if that's okay. Could you tell us a bit? And again, we know here that there are developments going on. Again, I've already mentioned that we know tens of billions are being put into the infrastructure. What exactly is this new space and satellite capability able to do?
Okay, I'll flip down to something here. Okay, this is the kind of PR stuff the Americans put out, or we put out. But this is about DARC, the Deep Space Advanced Radar Function. So if you imagine these are looking from Earth up into geosynchronous orbit, 36,000 kilometers or so up in the air. And CSPOC down the bottom, sounds like from Star Wars, and I think that's actually intentional, is Combined Space Operations Command. Combined, it used to be JSPOC for joint. Combined means that it's US plus, and in fact there are 5 other countries involved in it at the moment. So CSPOC is Combined Space Operations, getting information through Pine Gap on the right, the OPIR sensor, the infrared sensors that Pine Gap monitors. And then there's a foreign launch, and a high value asset is seen by DARC, that cluster of antennas in the center there, and they assess it, whether it's what it is, whether it's a threat, whether another one is maneuvering, and then it's looking for other targets. DARC, and there's also a deep space optical sensor, a telescope. Now, Northwest Cape has got a radar, a minor one called the C-band radar, it doesn't matter for the moment. The deep space optical sensor is the space surveillance telescope just outside the administrative area of Harold Holt. And that's a very large, very modern, the most modern and advanced automated space sensor, optical sensor that there is in the world. And then next door to it, just in the last month or so, the deep space advanced radars there, and that enables those two, the optical and the radar sensors, enable very precise detection, measurement of movement, and then identification of pretty much anything in geostationary, geosynchronous orbit. And that's it. That's essentially, the justification is usually just to find out space junk. That would be a nice thing to do. What it's really there for is for warfighting, for space warfighting. And we are very, very deeply involved in this now. And I'll just show you, I just found the other day, exactly where that antenna array is. 27 antennas, I think from memory, either 12 or 15 meters across. These are very large. And what's unique about this, hasn't been done anywhere else, is that the Americans have managed to find a way of increasing the power and hence the sensitivity of the radar receivers by getting up to 27 different antennas coordinated and working as one. And that changes everything. And then for you, I think the important thing is to say this is a very big issue in Wales, where the second site is now under construction. And I've mentioned to Leonie that the people in the activist groups in Wales really want to make contact with your group. So this is about space warfighting. Let's be very, very clear about it.
Yeah. Now, it probably seems obvious, but I think, again, for the bigger narrative, it's worth kind of restating things. You talk a lot in your analysis about the difference between assets and prime targets. In terms of an Australian military perspective, how much of this is an asset and how much of it actually makes us a prime target for the future conflicts?
Okay. It's very hard to say. We don't know. And it partly will depend on a decision that was talked about back in Cold War, in the end of the Cold War, that the Pine Gaps of the world were safe from attack because the other side would know that if Pine Gap was destroyed and the Russian equivalent, Soviet equivalents were destroyed, then there would be no command and control facility. And nobody wanted that. In other words, that would be a break. Whether this, and that argument has now been raised, in particular in relation to the dark facility, because there's nothing nearly so capable has emerged so far. That said, we just don't know the answer to that. It would be whether it would require a nuclear weapon to disable it. I don't know. We don't quite know enough about how it actually operates yet. I'll just remind you, though, that all three of these major space assets at Exmouth, very close to the town of Exmouth, are controlled, well, certainly two, and it's very likely that this third one will be remotely controlled from RAF Base Edinburgh, just outside Adelaide. So in other words, the question there, whether Edinburgh is a more appropriate target than is the antenna. So I know this is a very cold-blooded way of thinking about it, but it's definitely, that's a question.
So
last thing, if I lived in Exmouth, I'd be asking questions about radiation issues around these immensely powerful transmitters. You certainly don't want to be anywhere near them, but still.
So you characterise the militarisation of North Australia as an arc. Is it?
Yeah.
And this was only 3 years ago. Is it? It seems to me that this arc is no longer an arc, but it's now a net that's been thrown pretty much around the entire coast.
Well, it was always a weak metaphor in all sorts of ways. So, but you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a pattern of expansion, and the important thing is to, for the military people to think about. And I've spent time talking to a lot of them, and you find in certain circumstances, alliance skeptics. I mean, they're not idiots. You find fascists, you find nutters, but you find them anywhere. And the question is, once you are signed in to this technology, once you have approved its general operating procedures, and in particular, once you have 1, 2, 3 cohorts of personnel who have spent time in the US training on this, and this will apply to the nuclear submarines, of course, then careers get built around it. And all these are disincentives from, if you like, disentangling us in these operations.
Thank you very much for that. I think that's a really good point to hand over to Elizabeth to maybe talk about the domestic surveillance issues from Kojarina.
Well, I always think of Kojarina. It's a little bit of a sleeper. It's this quiet one that nobody really knows a great deal about. And of course, the expansions in that for Kojarina have been happening for a lot longer than what's happening now on many of the bases. I'm thinking 2007, 2015, there was definitely another expansion. I think there's been more since then. Its connection to MUOS is sort of better known. There was around 2015, they talked about Echelon. Now, you never hear that anymore, and that was never admitted to. But from what we read at the time in 2015, it also had a capacity for domestic surveillance and maybe even broader than that. But have you got any knowledge and clarity around those sorts of things with Kojarina?
Well, to take the domestic surveillance part, no, I don't have clarity about it. Obviously, they have the technical capability to do it. Whether they do the Five Eyes institutional mythology is no, we don't look at our own. Brackets, that does not mean that our colleagues don't look at our own. You make sense. So, for example, the best example of that is in Germany, where even the German government under Merkel admitted that, that they were getting data about their people from the Americans. So we don't know. It's really very hard to answer that. I think we know pretty much what happens. Sorry, to make clear, there are three main facilities, four facilities at Codgerino. One is the well-established Australian communication spy base. That is, it's a satellite communications interception facility. Most notably, its role was revealed by the Snowden documents in 2012 when we were spying on the Indonesian president, his wife, his cabinet during the climate change negotiations in Bali. And that involved Codgerina, probably Pine Gap, and certainly Shoal Bay. It's really important for us as a straightforward spying facility, focusing on communication satellite. And then, as you said, the Americans have built two new facilities there. One, MUOS, which essentially is a ruggedized military global smartphone system and like your smartphones can plug into pretty much anything as the Americans want to on their Defense Information Systems Agency computer circuits. The second is the wideband global system antennas. Wideband global systems are now a slightly aging global large capacity satellite system the Americans have. Essentially, if you think about all those drones, surveillance drones for visual, optical, infrared, signals intelligence operations, in part related to drone assassination issues. These are not the drones that do the killing, but you need the targeting. That consumes a vast amount of bandwidth, and the Codgerina facility is one part of that. There's been a third development, and it's taken a long time to sort this out because then there seems to have been some hold up. There is now a satellite communication station west, which is actually on Codgerina, and we've identified which one it is. It's on our website you've got a link to. And that is related to, in ways we don't completely understand, to the Australian Triton surveillance, very large Triton surveillance uncrewed aerial vehicles or drones that are going to be operating from Tyndall. I think they are operating from Tyndall now, and Edinburgh, which is their home base. There is a parallel one in New South Wales, Satellite Station East, which has been operating for a little while. We've got a link to that you can have a look at. But again, this is something where the American technology, and Australia owns one of the WGS satellites, giving us access to all of it. But once you're in that system, it's very useful for you, but it's very hard to say, oh, we don't want you to use it for anything that we would disapprove of, if we ever disapproved of anything. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, thank you for that. That's, yeah.
And again, you're quite right. It's very quiet. People don't talk about it. The Australian satellite communications interception is just, well, we do it, don't we? What's your problem? Well, there are lots of problems about it. But I think it's actually the other facilities which are more dangerous because they absolutely tie us not into intelligence issues, but into operational issues. So going back to my first argument, the current militarisation has two parts. One is the weapons and their enabling platforms, and Codgerina, MUOS, WGS is part of that. And then the surveillance, intelligence, communications. And on that last one, I'll just remind you that nuclear command, control, intelligence is now fused in American doctrine with conventional command control. And that means it's a lot harder when push comes to nasty shove to keep control of the nuclear escalation possibilities. Because it's tied together much more than it was before.
Okay. If I can just ask a supplementary question. Given the tangle that we're in at the moment, given the kind of the drive to interoperability with the US military. Are there any other examples globally that we can learn from, or are we in a kind of unique strategic position here? How do we organize against this?
I don't think we're in a unique position. And I think our situation is becoming more like that of Britain, and I'll say what, and Europe in generally, and well, in Japan. Japan's slightly different. Firstly, I think and this is relevant to movement issues. One is, I think what is AUKUS, in a sense, has been a bad story for the Australians and for the Americans. They're stuck with it now, leaving aside all the problems of AUKUS, doesn't matter. But what I think is really planned is raising Australia to the status of NATO level integration with American planning, but not with a NATO style agreement, because that would be a huge fight. Rather, we are seeing on a whole series of things, almost everything we've talked about today, and rather more we could look at, particularly at Pine Gap. We are step by step surveillance or weapon system or weapons platform, one by one, we are connecting closer and with less of what the optimists call wiggle room to American planning. And so I think that we should be looking at campaigns in Europe, particularly Britain, not because Britain speaks English, but just because it's the closest American ally. I would urge you to try and make contact with Japanese peace groups over issues like submarines, because they have the same problem that we have. And then it's a matter, this is the more difficult one, of making contact with American groups, because there's not a lot of thinking about this. And I was talking to an English academic who works in these areas, who's pretty smart, who just said, look, Richard, in Britain, nobody knows the word AUKUS. It just doesn't come up. And I think that's absolutely right about it. So that makes life hard. But on particular issues like DARK or particular issues like submarines, there are a possibility of making connections. But essentially, I think that we are being made much more in the British/NATO image, with one variation, and I'll finish on this. It's clear that Trump doesn't care about Europe. It's clear that Trump has very peculiar ideas about Putin and about Ukraine. And we see that every day. I think, on the contrary, Australia is going to be loved by the Americans. And that's going to be the problem, because we are the most suitable platform for China. And yeah, I'll finish on that.
Okay, thanks very much. I think, Leonie, shall I hand over to you for any supplementary questions and then closing?
Okay, thanks. Richard, one thing that people in our group have queried as we've tossed around different perspectives on Australia's allegiance to the US and wanting to extract from it. One thing, of course, is how that could happen in terms of AUKUS. But in regard to the areas that you've touched on, it is so enmeshed, involved, and interdependent. Is there any way, do you see it in Australia's best interest to even try and extract itself from such dependency on the US in terms of these other areas of concern?
Yes, I think that on almost everything, let me reverse it. I can certainly think that you could put a version of saying there are aspects of Pine Gap's operation, of the surveillance systems we're looking at, and even you could say of the Stirling expansion. There are aspects which could be argued to be in Australia's interest. The question is, in each one, are those positive aspects outweighed by the negatives? And I would say almost everywhere they are. And then if you then say, yes, there is an Australian interest in those activities, what would be an autonomous Australian manner of replacing those capabilities if you think we want them? In other words, if you take a pacifist position, then there's not much to argue about. If you take an argument which would say, Paul Dibb's planning for in the 1986 Defence of Australia review, where he put the argument for essentially a continental defence of Australia, moving defence assets from Sydney and Melbourne to places where they might have some conceivable relevance under very specified limited circumstances, then you may say we want to have a defence capability, we want to have some kind of intelligence capability. I just point out that on the intelligence side of it, the second most capable global signals intelligence capability after the Americans is the French, and they built that entirely on their own. Now, they use their colonies, or well, that's an obvious kind of point there. But what I'm getting at is you then need to be involved in a discussion about, well, what are Australia's actual defence requirements, and then what capabilities do we need to indigenously, autonomously establish and create? That's detailed work. It's rather awful in many cases because you come up against warfighting scenarios. But I think that it is necessary to separate out those stages. My argument about Pine Gap is really very strongly, as you know, I argue that Australia should be signing and ratifying the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and we do so on the basis that we give the Americans a 5-year notice that we are requiring them to close down one specific part of Pine Gap, which is the most egregious violation of the prohibition on assistance to nuclear weapon use and threats, namely the infrared station called the Relay Ground Station. And I've put an argument about how that can be done without threatening American genuine national security interests. In other words, the politics are awful, but they're not impossible. And on all of these, the politics are really bloody hard. We know that. But I think putting an argument about what are actual Australian national interests, which you then work through, is a starting point. Does that make sense, Leonie?
Yes, thanks very much. And I think that's a really pertinent point to end this conversation on. So yeah, on behalf of Stop AUKUS and others who are online, thank you so much for giving us your time. And hopefully we can have an ongoing channel of communication to keep you updated with anything from on the ground here. And obviously we follow closely your website and any updates that may be on that. So
I'll just say on that, look, there you saw the list of sites on that Australian Defence Facilities website. Some of them I haven't been able to get back to for 10 years. There is no time. And I would appreciate anybody sending me updates on your own links. That would be very, very useful. My colleague Vince Scapatura unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but he and I are working a great deal at the moment on those wider issues that we've been finishing on. And I urge you to talk to him. He's really very good.
Yes, no, in the conversations or the email conversations when Vince said he was unable to attend, we thought it might be good, hopefully, to have a link up in the future and also look further at the the Air Force bases, in the north.
In the north, that would be good. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to everybody. This session's been recorded. I presume you're okay with that, Richard, and we can then circulate the PowerPoint, very valuable, and the recording of this session to our group for those that weren't able to come. Just for your reference, there are a couple of things that are clashing with the timing of this, including a major protest in the city at the moment, countering the far right. So, yeah. But rest assured, people will get the message and receive a copy of the PowerPoint link.
Okay, good on you. Okay, thanks. Very nice to meet you all. Thanks very, very much.
Equally. Thank you. And thank you for all you do. Thank you.
Righto. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.